in Virginia.
They lost 20 years to do that.
Ready?
Of course, they beat you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here this morning, have everyone with us, and good to see the folks here in church. I do want to start a lesson out by, we want to remember a lot of people in prayer this morning. Remember Norma's family. It's always hard to lose a family member, much less a mother. So remember that family, and she will be missed here at the church greatly. And I always remember when we were without a pastor here, I was the chair of the deacons, and Norma would always call me and keep me up to speed on who was sick, who needed to be visited, and everything like that. And I just thought that was just, and I never will forget when Hazel lost GC. That morning we got word that he was gone, and as quick as I found out, I left my home, which I just lived a couple of miles away. And as I got there to Hazel and GC's home, I met Norma coming out. She'd already been there. And so that tells you what kind of lady she was. And just, we will miss her greatly. And she was somebody special to me and her family. But we have other concerns too. Jody lost her mother as well. And I'm sure that family is just worn out here with dealing with her illness and then her death. And Miss Hull and had to travel up to Hillsville. That's where she was buried with her husband, I'm sure. And funeral was up there yesterday. But just remember them. And of course, they're dealing with Mildred. Mildred is, she's just very sick, but I think she's improving the last I heard now. I haven't asked Mike lately because I know they was involved in the funeral of Miss Hull. But anyhow, remember her and keep her in your prayers and the family, and just strength for Jody and Mike and Jacob. And so very small family, and when it gets to that point, it's very difficult when you don't have a whole lot of people to come in and support you, and so it's hard. And there's other people's lost loved ones. It's very difficult at this time to do. And of course, we've got other needs here in the church. You can go down the pew and find somebody that's got a concern and something to pray about. So remember that, and always, I never want to overlook Dan and Karen. Dan to me is just such an inspiration to be. When I see him here at church, he just, man, he won't give up, and that's a great trait to have. And so remember them, and I'm sure there's others. I don't want to leave anybody out. Everybody's had sickness and trouble, and it's very difficult. But welcome this morning. And always remember when you pray for our brothers and sisters in Christ, and that we can be some kind of light to lead people to Christ. And many times for me personally, when I don't know how to pray, because you don't know a lot of times the family situations and all that. But for me, I always just pray that somehow they could see Jesus through any of the problems that they have, and get somebody to show Jesus to them. And so that's very important, and that's the most important thing in our lives today. So welcome this morning. We're here in our live stream and in-person class this morning here at Clintwood Baptist Church. It's November the 14th, and we just got a month and a half left till we're at the first of the year again in 2022. That's hard for me to kind of wrap my mind around, but it's here, and so we're at that point. So we have Thanksgiving coming up, and it's always a good time to reflect on how good God has been to us. And it's difficult sometimes when you're going through rough times to realize that. I heard the statement many times, and you have too, probably, God is good, and He's good all the time. And sometimes that's hard to see, but that's a true statement. So we are coming up in a time of Thanksgiving here in our nation, and we've got troubles, but God still has been good to us. When you look around the world, and we've got problems, but He's been good to us. And so let's thank Him for that, and be thankful and grateful that He's still there. He hadn't left us. He hadn't forsaken us. And one day He's going to make things right. He's going to take care of all this crazy stuff, and it'll be made right. And I don't know if we'll be alive to see it, but we'll see it one way or the other. So we have come to our fifth lesson in our series, Walk in Confidence. And that's always a word, confidence. Have you ever seen somebody that maybe didn't know what they was talking about, but they was confident in it? And so they kind of recruited people that would follow them because of their confidence. And I always thought of that. Every time I write this down in our series here, I think of that people may not know what they're doing, but they've got confidence with it. So we've got something that we know what we're doing, so we can be confident in what God has given us and given His Word. And this series here has focused on the life of Abram in Genesis, and I encourage you, as when we've got one more lesson after this, and it'll be the week after Thanksgiving. I encourage you to go back and read this whole thing and pull it together in your mind, and it will bless your heart to see the life of Abram and how he wasn't perfect, but God blessed him. And that's what he was blessed by God, even though he wasn't perfect. And to me, that always gives me encouragement that He'll bless me and bless us, because we're definitely not perfect. We only get our perfection through Jesus Christ. And of course, I always want to mention, because we are live streaming, that we're taking our verses out the King James Version. We'll be in chapter 16 and 17 today. And the title of our lesson today is Confidence After We Fail. And you know, a lot of times when we fail, we kind of get down and we say, well, you know, we've let God down and He don't want anything to do with us. And that's not correct, because He stands there and waiting for us to come back. We have a great picture of that in the story of the prodigal son in the New Testament. And of course, that father is representative of God there in that story. But our lesson focuses on Abram and Sarai. God hadn't changed their names, but they do. He changes their names here in 17, taking matters into their own hands rather than and waiting on God's promise. And as I was preparing for the lesson, thinking about it, and that's so typical of us, isn't it? You know, we get impatient. I was just sitting this week, right after I had read this very thing that I was preparing here. The morning I get up sometimes, and it was probably on Monday morning that I wrote this down to remind me to take matters into their own hands. I was coming back from, I think I went up to McDonald's forgive me for that. I'll confess this morning, but I went up to McDonald's to get a biscuit, and I was coming back down here to the stoplight down here at the three-way, and there was somebody in front of me. And most of the time when you see that, they're either thinking about something or they're on the phone. And the light changed and went to green. And matter of fact, there was two cars in front of me. And the one that was there at the green light, they just kept sitting there, you know. And I had the urge to blow, but I didn't. Not that I was any better than anybody else, but that car in front of me took care of it for me. I didn't have to worry about it. Yeah, and so that's what I was thinking. They're taking it into their own hands, not depending on them people there in front. And so this is what happens in our lesson today as we look at Abram and Sarai, and they were trying to hurry God's promise along. And that's in I know you all read this and been in messages that has went over this. Sarai gave Abram her handmaid. This handmaid, her name was Hagar, and today in our society we would probably call this situation Hagar would be what we would term a surrogate woman, or someone, or a surrogate mother that would carry someone else's child until birth and then give it to the wife of the man. Now today we do it in a lab, and it's not one-on-one like it was back then, but nonetheless, it's still the same principle, and it's called a surrogate. And when you look into that arrangement, and I know you all probably watch movies about it, and of course I've given up my TV. I don't even have a TV anymore. And well, I got one, but I don't turn it on much. And that arrangement seldom works out. Now I'm sure there's probably some that I don't know about that has worked out, but most of the time it brings on major problems because different folks in our society today generally never do anything unless they got an agenda. One of two things: they either want the position, and that translates to power, and the other one is money. One of the two. And so generally that's why it never works out. And in our situation, in our story today, Ishmael was born out of that union with Abraham and Hagar. And God actually blessed Ishmael, and he's still blessing him today, really. And I know I had a friend of mine that went to Israel and had a Muslim tour guide, but he was saved. Okay. And he was the tour guide, and someone had said something about Isaac. He said, well, I'm a descendant of Ishmael, but God's blessed us too. He's our father. So he got it too. And that's the thing about how God just works into that. Now, before I go too far, I wanted to say that Hagar's name means stranger. And where that comes from is she come out of Egypt. Okay. And we got to realize that after Hagar had her son Ishmael, God later gave Abram and Sarai a son, Isaac, as he had been promised. Isaac was the promised son, and God's purpose would be continued through Isaac. Okay, and we all have tendency to try and figure out our own problems rather than asking Him for help. And I know I'm the world's worst, because when you're faced with something you have to work on here in this life, I exhaust everything I've got trying to figure it out. And then finally I said, I need to pray. And that's when things get worked out. And then you look back and you say, well, it wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it was. And so many times that happens. Not always, but so many times that happens. So just remember, we are never beyond God's grace and love. And I'm so thankful for that today, that you never get too far that God can't reach you. Praise the Lord for that. So even when we fail, he will renew our confidence and use us for his purpose. And isn't that wonderful to think about that? Even though we fail, he will still use us. So as we looked in previous lessons in our series here, so far in Genesis 12 through 15, that covers a 10-year span in Abram's life and journey with God. And we have seen that God called Abram to Canaan in just a small review here, and promised to make him a great nation. Okay? And we've known that all along here, and he's known that for 10 years. Okay? And though Abram, all the families would experience God's blessing through him, I dare say that he probably didn't comprehend that. Because if God come to Skip and said, Skip, I'm going to bless the whole world through you. I mean, how do you get your head around that? And I dare say that he probably didn't at that time. But as time went on and experience comes, you grow in confidence when you have events come and it turns out the way, say, God tells you, you get confidence in it. And that's what our lesson is all about. But Abram, he arrived in Canaan and built an altar to the Lord at Shechem and at Bethel. And you see that in chapter 12 of Genesis, verses 8 and through verses 2 through 8. And then we know about the famine that came, and they fled to Egypt. And we saw Abram feared for his life and told Sarah to tell that bunch of down there in Egypt that she was his sister, not his wife, because he figured he was taking care of Abram. And we saw that in our lesson as we studied. But to ensure that his plan would be carried out correctly, God intervened right there. And he does so many times in our life, doesn't he? He intervened, and he scared the daylights out of the Pharaoh. And and he protected both of them from being harmed, that's Sarai and Abram. Why? Because he had promised that he was going to bless them, and that was in his plan. And I'm not saying we walk around 10 foot tall and bulletproof, but people, we're under stress because of the fear of this coronavirus. And I could get off on that and talk about that, but I've done it as, I don't know, till I'm blue in the face, I guess. But not that it's not real, but there's a bigger thing going on here. And you can study it and research it yourself. You don't have to believe anything I say, but you can find it. It's not very hard. And so the fear is the thing that has scared people to death. And so Abram, he finally, at the end of our lesson today, we will see that he fully believed God. And but upon the return, after they left Egypt, and God had got a hold of the Pharaoh, and they come out of Egypt, and man, he was wealthier than when he went in. That's how God works. And they come out, him and Lot both. They had great wealth, and we studied. One of our lessons was that when they got back to Canaan, that the pastors wouldn't support their flocks, so they had some problems. And at that point, we saw Abram step up and gives us a glimpse at his character. And he was a man of good character. God had promised him that whole land. And I pointed out last week that he told Lot, you take what you want. I mean, that's pretty big, isn't it? Because you get people riled up. And the biggest trouble we have in our society is about money and land. You think about it. And people don't like to give up either. And when it costs them. So he allowed Lot to pick anywhere he wanted. And then right after that, right after they separated, God told Abram to travel through the land and see one day that his descendants was going to be possessing that land. And then we saw the rescue of Lot after that, after Lot kind of got down and fell into trouble. And God spoke to Abram again to tell him that an heir would come from his own body. And that's really important to note that. And they would be as numerous as the stars of heaven. And we saw it that they would be as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And then in another one, we saw it dust of the earth. That's big number. And Abram believed God, and we saw last week God counted it, or used a bookkeeping term. He credited it to him for righteousness, put it on his ledger as a credit. And I don't know about you, when I get a bank statement, I like to see them credits, don't you? You don't see many of them, but you get to see some. And Abram was righteous on the basis of faith alone. That's very important, okay? He didn't work for it. God gave it to him through his grace and mercy. On top of that, God spoke to Abram in a dream and told him about the Egyptian bondage and how he would bring the folks back to the land of Canaan. Isn't that strange that he would, at that point, tell about the 400 years that the Hebrews would stay in Egypt? Well, 430, I think, is the exact number. But and at that point, when he told him that, this is where our lesson starts. The first point of our lesson today: don't take matters into your own hands. And this is in 16, the first 5 verses. Some have said that they wish that chapter 16 of Genesis was not in the Bible, because it really sheds bad light on Abram. Because, I mean, he's at the mountaintop. God has taken care of him, and he's promised him that his descendants would bless the earth, and so it looks kind of bad. And the reason being, chapter 15 was the high water mark of Abram's life. And then we see the chapter 16, and he is actually just a man, just human, with flaws like us. And that's what's so beautiful about the Bible. It uses common people. And that always gives me hope. It gives me confidence that God is going to carry through what he said. And so in this chapter, we see a lapse in his faith relative to Sarai and Hagar and the Egyptian handmaid. But we'll not come down too hard on Abram and Sarai, because I will explain a little bit as we go in that. And although I'm not taking up for them what they did, okay, I'm just wanting to explain it just a little bit better so we can have a good understanding. So in verse 1 of chapter 16, it says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar." I mentioned last week that Abram got 2 things in Egypt that caused him a lot of trouble. And one of them was wealth. We saw last week that he and Lot had some differences there in the grazing rights. And so they separated. So that was a problem, but he worked through that. And then the next one was the Egyptian handmaid. And so that's a pretty tough one as well. But verse 2 tells us, and Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. The thing that Sarai suggested was, and this is where I want to expound on this a little bit, the thing that she suggested was a common practice of that day, because it was key to have children to tend to flocks and to do the other tasks that needed to be done for the family. And so a big family was by and large common in that day, and with her not having any children, that kind of relegated her to no purpose. You see what I'm talking about? And so when a wife could not have, there was always a concubine situation. And the most famous one in the Bible, of course, is Solomon, because it is recorded that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And I always thought that, boy, at birthday time, he was in the conundrum. But he would have a big problem here, and that's what they used the concubines for at that time. Now I'm not sure Solomon did, but they in other situations they would use a concubine to raise up a family so they could have people to attend the duties of life. And now notice I didn't say God approved it. Okay. God did not approve of this at all, and but he allowed it. Why? Because we learn by our failures. And I, for one, believe that this brought Abram closer to God, because he realized he had messed up, and he had messed up bad. And when he did that, what happens? There's two things that happen. Either we blame God and move away from him, or we draw to God and move closer to him. And this situation gives us a great example of Abram moving to God. And always remember, Sarai was the one that had the idea. Abram went along with it, but now he had the option of saying no. And of course, we're using our own Western logic here to analyze this. And that's not always the correct way to do it. But in a sense, when we're studying these things, we're Westerners, so we're going to look through that prism. And so in verse 3 it says, And Sarai, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband, Abram, to be his wife. And that's simply a way of saying that he went into her and as having a child. We see that Abram and Sarai tried to help God fulfill his promise to Abram. Don't we always do that? We try to help God along, don't we? You know? And they took matters into their own hands rather than fully trusting God's promise. And boy, I'd like to stay here. I'd like to stand right here and say, I would have done better than that. But you know something? We don't know until we're faced with it, do we? And it's very easy to read the account and be pious about it and say how we wouldn't have done that same way, but we never know. What Abram and Sarai and Hagar did was perfectly in accordance with the ancient Near Eastern law and practice. And that's what I wanted to point out to you. And technically, in that day, in their common social life, it was very accepted. Okay? But of course, years later here, we're looking at it, we know it's not accepted, and we have the record of it, and we have the benefit of what God puts in the record. And you know, when you think about it, How many of us would want everything written about our life? I, for one, wouldn't. I wouldn't want every detail of my life written down. Would you, Danny? I would not. Would not. But see, the Bible does that. It picks out different people like Abram and writes those things down. So he doesn't look perfect. And he wasn't. So God had told Abram in chapter 15, verse 4, one who comes from your own body will be your heir. And you know, as you think about that, technically, it was the custom of the day, and here Hagar was the handmaid of Sarai. Technically, you could rationalize it out that he figured that he was okay. Okay, but God had viewed it a different way. And the reason I say that is when you go back and read that in chapter 15, God doesn't particularly say that it would be Sarai that would bring that descendant. He doesn't say that. Chapter 15, verse 4, Junior. And the promise did not specifically mention Sarai. And with that being the custom of that day, you know, you could rationalize things. We always do, even when we don't have support of the social system. Okay, sometimes our own lives tensions exist between trusting God and planning ahead, don't it? Always does. When should we trust God? When should we take action based on the intelligence God has given us? And that's a perfectly good question. You know, if we have something, an event coming up, and it seems like there's no move of God and something's got to be done, what do? We got to move, don't we? Good, for instance, here, I just thought of a very small example in our church here. When we have Vacation Bible School, it's almost the last minute that we fill all the teaching positions, all the positions in school. And what happens is we panic a little bit right before it happens, and then we end up having enough. And I, for one, believe God brings people, speaks to people, and they come, they step forward. That's the way I believe it happens. And but the thing about it is, and you all are face everyday situations too, choices are not always clear, but in any case, we need to pray in every decision. That's the first thing we need to do. And if we can get in that habit of doing that, I am sure that'll take a lot of tension out of our lives and a lot of the stress. But in verse 4, it says, and he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. And this is the thing that happened here, and this is the thing that results when we get out of God's will. It almost immediately turns bad, turns south. I guess the phrase goes. But initially, it looked like the plan had worked. But Abram had fathered a child which Sarai would adopt as her own. When Hagar had accomplished something Sarah had longed for to do, Hagar despised Sarai or treated her with contempt. She realized here that she was carrying the child of the high father. Okay? So she took pride in it. And she knew she had something on Sarai. Just think every day Sarai could see Hagar's midsection